If I ask any American what the phrase a la mode means, they'll probably give me the same answer, a very specific answer. A la mode means with 1 scoop of vanilla ice cream on top. But if you're a French person watching this video, well, first of all, je suis désolé pour être américain, c'était pas mon choix. But second, you might have found that whole a la mode definition kind of odd, because a la mode means something completely different in French. A la mode means in fashion, in the same way that, I don't know, a hat can be in fashion or a TikTok trend. Dishes can be a la mode, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they had ice cream on them. For instance, there's a dish called Boeuf a la mode, which is beef a la mode, which, believe it or not, features no vanilla ice cream. So how have we as Americans decided on this completely random definition? Well, our version comes from the 90s. According to legend, pie a la mode was first served at the Cambridge Hotel in Washington County, New York. In particular, one Dr. Charles Watson loved this dish, so much so that when he went to the Big Apple, he spread the word. The dish hit it big across the US. Since this is one of the very few contexts that Americans ever hear this phrase a la mode, it kind of just became the de facto definition. 1 scoop of vanilla ice cream. What I find most interesting about a la mode than other phrases, which I'll talk about in a sec, is that these phrases have been taken completely out of their Francophone context and given a completely new definition that only makes sense in English-speaking contexts. It's become English in a way. I want to talk about these fake French phrases like a la mode, but also some fake English phrases that have been kind of deformed going into the French language. Along the way, I'm hoping we can laugh, learn, and slowly feed the blood feud between the French and the Americans, as is my favorite pastime. Let's continue with our fake French with the word touché. Now, the word touché in American English, it means a kind of like, you got me in an argument. If someone says a witty comeback or has a particularly good argument, say touché, to kind of concede. But touché in French just means touched, in the same way that you could be physically touched or emotionally touched. Us Americans adopted this phrase from fencing terminology. In fact, a lot of the fencing terms that we use, like en garde, are originally French as well. During a fencing match, if you're touched by your opponent and you're a graceful loser, you'll say touché to acknowledge that you've been touched. Because of this, we've been using this phrase in English as far back as 1897 at least. But say touché in an argument in French and you might get some weird looks. Sometimes we don't change the meaning of a word, we just shorten it in a really weird way or change the spelling. Like my favorite example is Maître d or Maître d. It comes from the French Maître d'hôtel, which means master of the house. And it means the same thing. It means like a head waiter at a restaurant. We used to say this full term Maître d'hôtel, but then about 50 years ago, we just started cutting off the whole last part of the phrase, saving America's head waiters entire seconds to spend how they please. I find this one really interesting because if you're anything like me, you hear this term in American English and you're like, it looks kind of weird, but that must be because it's French, right? But this term looks equally weird in French too, because you never just have the D apostrophe. You don't even know really how to pronounce that. It would be like the equivalent of taking, you know, the master of the house and just changing it to mastera. Next up, we have cliquez sur j'aime et abonnez-vous, which means like the video and subscribe. Guys, how did this get me? I'm sorry. Don't do that. Not unless you want to help the channel a little bit and make me a little happy. Anyways, we've got a bunch of other miscellaneous expressions, like how matinee in French, it just means morning. Also, the term corsage refers to the blouse in French. So most of these fake French terms, as you can see, were coined more in the 1800s. If I were to give my reason as to why, it's because during that time, French was more of a dominant language. It was acting as more of an international lingua franca. It was also before the US was a superpower and had this kind of cultural hegemony spreading its language. And you see that over the course of the 20th century, French actually starts picking up most of its anglicismes or its English phrases. But in the same way, it also has these kind of fake English phrases, which I find a little bit hilarious. In French, it seems like they take words that they already know, like basic English words, but they just combine them in ways that sound kind of like English, but really aren't. My favorite example being that the term for foosball or table soccer is le baby foot, which I'm like, yeah, you know, that it is a baby foot. Also, if you have a night out in America, you might go to a pre-game before the party and an after party afterwards. But in France, you go to un before and un after, which at first I guess kind of catches me off guard, but I guess it makes sense. These are very practical phrases. A fun little tendency you see in these fake English phrases is the inclusion of ing. The result are some words that sound like English but really just aren't. Can you guess what brushing, footing, and relooking are? Well, if you were to guess a blow dry, a jog, and a makeover, then you must be French, because these phrases don't make any sense to my American ears. To be fair, the French people did eventually catch themselves on this whole faire du footing, and now they say faire du jogging. But also, they have another term, which is un jogging, which refers to like a tracksuit. You can do jogging, or you can wear jogging. Other times, they'll just slap an ing at the end of random words. One of my favorites being shampoo becomes shampoing. In fact, I would go as far to say that the French are so ing obsessed that they've taken regular phrases and shortened them to just keep the ing. So instead of having the living room, they shortened it to living. Parking lot became parking. One curious example of this is the tuxedo. So back in the late 19th century, the British people referred to a tuxedo as a smoking jacket. And so the French did their thing. They referred to it, boom, as le smoking. But then the British people stopped referring to it almost immediately afterwards, and so now call it, I guess, a dinner jacket. So we call it tuxedo, British people call it a dinner jacket, but the French people are wearing a smoking. To a lesser extent, the French people also do this with the words woman and man at the end of words. So for instance, a record holder in a sport for a while would be called a record woman or a record man. Or a tennis player would be called a tennis woman or a tennis man. And this also extends to sportsman, barman, policeman. But from what I understand, this is a bit less common nowadays. Speaking of sports, another interesting example is basketball. Much like the example of jogging, what they did was they took the term le basketball and then started shortening it just to le basket. And then they also started using le basket to refer to the shoes that you wear during basketball. So what we would call sneakers or tennis shoes, they call les baskets. You can play basket, you can wear basket, it's basket all around. If you find these translation tidbits kind of interesting, you would probably also find interesting that the French don't really have a word for race, at least not how we think about it in the United States. They have a completely different concept for it, and I made a video about that too, which you can check out on the screen.